Hello, and welcome to the second podcast in the series on Jewish temple theology. There is much new scholarship in the past decades, both Jewish and Christian, on this topic. In this series, we are not searching for the Jesus of history in Christianity, but rather the Jesus that his followers and contemporaries knew. This particular podcast will be on the temple as an expression of Genesis creation, along with the significance of the temple structure to that in the creation process. My name is Jeffrey Taylor, and I will be your podcast host. A temple stood in Jerusalem for over 1,000 years. According to the biblical account, the first temple was built by Solomon around 950 BCE and was severely damaged by the Babylonians about 350 years later. It was rebuilt towards the end of the 6th century BCE by people who returned from exile in Babylon, and was rebuilt again by Herod the Great at the end of the 1st century BCE. The structure was finally destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, but the influence of the temple and its world has far outlasted its physical existence. Jesus would have known Herod's temple, and he prophesied its destruction. From this, we might assume that Jesus was opposed to the temple, but in fact, as we shall see, the world of the temple was the world of the first Christians, and they expressed their faith in terms drawn almost exclusively from the temple. However, Jesus and his followers opposed what the temple had become. They identified themselves as the true temple, with Jesus as the great high priest. So, here is a summary for the first part of our podcast on Genesis creation and the temple. First, the historical context. The Jerusalem temple stood for over 1,000 years, from Solomon's construction in 950 BCE through multiple rebuildings until its final destruction by the Romans in 70 CE. Next, Jesus and the temple. Jesus and early Christians didn't oppose the temple itself, but rather what it had become. They saw themselves as the true temple with Jesus as the high priest. Jesus was charged with threatening to destroy and rebuild the temple, which connected to prophecies in the book of Enoch about the Messiah's role in temple renewal. The claim about rebuilding the temple and being the Messiah were interconnected, as the book of Enoch prophesied the Lord of the sheep would replace the old temple with a greater one. This reference in the book of Enoch to the Lord of the sheep replacing the temple is thought by scholars to be the source of where Jesus gets referred to as the Good Shepherd, referring back to the Lord of the sheep in Enoch. Getting back to our summary here, issues about temple research challenges. Biblical text alone provides limited understanding of temple theology, lacking critical information about priests' beliefs and ritual meanings. Different biblical accounts show discrepancies in temple descriptions, particularly regarding the cherub throne and the veil, the Holy of Holies, suggesting possible theological tensions. Lastly is theological significance. Key temple elements such as atonement, the heavenly throne, the temple veil, and the invocation of God became central to early Christian theology and practices. Understanding the temple requires examining various ancient sources beyond biblical text to properly illuminate Christian practices. When Jesus was arrested by the temple authorities, one of the charges brought against him was threatening to destroy the temple and to rebuild it in 3 days. This is in Mark chapter 14, verse 58, and I'll read. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Another charge was claiming to be the Messiah. This can be found in Matthew chapter 26, verses 63 and 64, which I'll read. And I quote, But Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. These were two aspects of the same charge, as can be deduced from the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch described the judgment of the fallen angels, and then how the Lord of the sheep would carry away the old temple and set up something greater in its place. I'll read now from the book of 1 Enoch, chapter 90, verses 28 and 29. And I stood up to see until that old house was folded up, and they removed all the pillars, and all the beams and ornaments of that house were folded up with it. And they removed it and put it in a place to the south of the land. And I saw until the Lord of the sheep brought a new house, larger and higher than the first one, and he erected it on the site of the first one that had been rolled up. And all its pillars were new, and its beams were new, and its ornaments were new, and larger than those of the first one, the old one that had been removed, and all the sheep were within it. This is the reason for the two questions at Jesus' trial. Did you claim that you would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? And are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? This same passage accounts for the exchange between Jesus and the Jews recorded in John, and I'll read. Jesus answered them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews said then, It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? Jesus was claiming the prophecy of Enoch, that he was the Lord of the sheep who would destroy and rebuild the temple. In first century Palestine, it would have been known that the Messiah, the Good Shepherd, would destroy and rebuild the temple. This is just one example to show why the book of Enoch and other similar texts are now recognized as important evidence for understanding Christian origins, especially in matters of the temple. This is also one of the points of origin of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Why use non-canonical references like the books of Enoch? If temple research were restricted to biblical text, the task would be almost impossible. Why this should be so is an important question, especially as the little information we have in biblical texts is inconsistent and concerns only the external aspects. The heart of the ancient faith is missing. There is nothing about what the priests believed themselves to be or what their rituals meant. There is no temple theology. I'm not going to read this particular section. If you'd like, you can pause the video and do the comparison between these two books to do on your own. Biblical texts about the temple have interesting discrepancies, as these two passages will point out. A comparison of the two accounts of Solomon's temple, that of the chronicler, who was a temple enthusiast, and that of the Deuteronomist, who was not, show that there was a sensitivity about certain aspects of the temple. The cherub throne in the Holy of Holies, for example, and the veil which screened it. The Deuteronomist, who did not like the temple, described only 2 golden cherubim in the Holy of Holies and said nothing of a veil. This is in 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 23 and 28. Whereas the chronicler described the cherubim as the golden chariot throne. This is in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 18. and they were screened by a veil of blue, purple, and crimson, woven with fine linen and embroidered with cherubim. This is in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 14. So, what was the problem with the throne and the veil? Were they just the chronicler's fantasy, or was the Deuteronomist censoring information about the temple? And what of atonement? Whoever compiled the final form of the Pentateuch denied that any one person could make atonement for another's sins. Why had Moses thought it possible to offer himself as the atonement? What we seem to have in this text is the promulgation of a new practice by means of the Moses story. One person making atonement for others is no longer possible in the era of the law, when each is responsible for his own sins. Whomever has sinned against me, him will I blot from my book. And so the Day of Atonement does not appear in the Deuteronomist calendar. Which of the biblical accounts is accurate? Was the ancient temple a place of atonement, a golden throne and a veil, with musicians invoking the presence of the Lord, or was it not? This is a matter of some importance for Christians, since these elements, atonement, which is one person offering himself for the sins of others, the heavenly throne, and the veil of the temple, are important in the New Testament. An invocation of God, which is the Greek word epiklesis, was central to early liturgies of the Christian community. Epiklesis is a Greek word that means invocation or calling upon, and it has multiple meanings in Christianity. So, is it possible to reconstruct something of the world of the temple using a range of ancient materials, not just biblical text, and then to show how this reconstruction can illuminate biblical text and Christian practices? I believe the answer is yes. So now, for the second part of our podcast on the structural significance of the temple, let's take a look first at historical context. During King Josiah's time, the first temple's sacred items, the Ark of the Covenant, the manna jar, Aaron's rod, the holy oil, were hidden away, leaving the Second Temple period without anointing or Messiah. The book of Revelation describes the ark's reappearance in the heavenly temple, connected to the vision of the messianic birth. Next, the temple as creation symbol. The tabernacle and the temple were physical representations of creations, with their construction matching the 6 days of Genesis. The building sequence paralleled creation. Moses received this temple design after spending 6 days in the cloud on Mount Sinai, where he witnessed the creation vision. Lastly, the symbolic structure. We'll have a chart of the 6 days of creation and the temple structure meaning. The Holy of Holies represented God's throne and creation's heart. The veil symbolized the material barrier between human perception and God's throne, and the 7-branched lamp represented the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. Here you see some of the items that were in the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, with the Ark of the Covenant being the one item that was by itself in the Holy of Holies. When the Babylonian Talmud was compiled, well into the Christian era, it was remembered that the furnishings of the first temple sanctuary had been hidden away in the time of King Josiah. The Ark of the Covenant containing the jar of manna and Aaron's rod, and the holy oil with which kings and priests had been anointed as well. Thus no one was anointed, and there couldn't have been no Messiah in the period of the Second Temple because of the lack of these items in the temple. The Ark was to reappear in the time of the Messiah, and the book of Revelation in the New Testament records that John saw the Ark in the heavenly temple just before the woman clothed with the sun gave birth to her child, the Messiah, who was taken up to the throne of God. I'll read now from Revelation, starting at chapter 11, verse 19, going through chapter 12, verse 2. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. There were flashes of lightning, rumbles, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. A description on Jewish midrash is in order at this point. The term midrash, meaning exposition or investigation, is used in two different senses. On the one hand, it refers to a mode of biblical interpretation prominent in the Talmudic literature. On the other hand, it refers to a separate body of commentaries on Scripture using this interpretive mode. The temple and the tabernacle, which for the most part shared its symbolism, represented the creation. The 6 days of creation described in Genesis 1 were replicated in Exodus by the 6 stages of building the desert tabernacle and the first temple. Now, I'm not going to read this large part in Exodus, but you can easily pause the video and contemplate it at your leisure. An early midrash declared, "The tabernacle is equal to the creation of the world," and proceeded to show how day 1 in the Genesis account corresponded to the Holy of Holies, the second day to the veil separating the Holy of Holies, the third day to the bronze laver, and the fourth day to the 7-branch lampstand. Shown here is a graphic of the floor plan for the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. It consists of 3 main sections: the Holy of Holies, the holy place, and the outer courtyard. You can see here that the Holy of Holies contained the Ark of the Covenant with the Shekinah. The Shekinah is the presence of God, illustrated by that little white spot on top of the ark, and it represented the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Then there was the veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place. In the holy place, there was the altar of incense, the menorah, candle, lampstand, and the table of shewbread. Then, finally, in the outer courtyard was the laver and the altar for the burnt offerings. Now, I couldn't really find a good picture of the inside of the Holy of Holies, so I made one in Photoshop. And as you can see here, the walls and ceiling of the Holy of Holies were plated with gold. The Ark of the Covenant sat in the center, and that space between the 2 angels is the mercy seat. The mercy seat is where, also known as the throne of God, and it's the place where God descended from heaven and literally had a physical presence between those 2 angels, which was referred to as the Shekinah, or the presence of God. So, how does all this correspond to the 6 days of creation? Well, I've made a little graphic here that I've numbered the days of creation inside the outline of the temple walls. First, the outer structure was set up, day 1, when God separated light from darkness. Then the veil was put in place to separate the Holy of Holies, corresponding to the second day of creation, when the heavens were set in place to separate what was above from what was below. On the third day, the table for the bread, wine, and incense was set in place to represent the third day of creation, when plants with seeds and fruit were made. On the fourth day, the 7-branched lamp was set in place to represent the great light set in the heaven on the fourth day. This was the link between Moses and the creation story. Moses had been in the cloud on Sinai for 6 days before the Lord spoke to him on the seventh day. And in those 6 days he had seen the creation. Immediately after this vision, he had been commanded to build the tabernacle according to what he had seen in his vision, and so the tabernacle represented the creation. In brief, the first 2 days of creation corresponded to the Holy of Holies and the veil. They show how traditions about the beginning of creation can help to reconstruct beliefs about the Holy of Holies and the veil, and how both can illuminate familiar biblical text. The 5th day represents the altar of burnt offerings. However, the 5th day's symbolism is a bit unclear due to the text conflicts and interpretation problems in Exodus 40. Lastly, on the 6th day, this is when humans were created. So, to finish up, let's have a little recap here in the form of a chart. So in temple theology, the actual construction and architecture of Solomon's temple and the tabernacle recounts the actual creation of the universe in macrocosmic symbolism. Day 1 corresponds to the Holy of Holies, and it means the throne of God, the hidden heart of creation, the source of life. Day 2 corresponds to the veil, that web of matter that conceals the throne of God from human perception. Day 3 is the temple for the bread, which represents the vegetation of the earth, wine, and incense. Day 4 is the 7-branched lampstand, which represents the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. Day 5 is the altar of burnt offerings. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. The symbolism is a bit difficult to tell from the translation, so we'll just leave it at that. And finally, day 6 corresponds to the day that the day where humans were created, and it represents the high priest who represents all of humanity, and he's the high priest of all creation.